Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the IPNA Embossed Webmaster Series 2021. We have a pediatric glomerular disease symposium. Now we have entered into webinar 4. Today we have our speaker, Dr. Pankaj Bansali.
Hello.
Dr. Pankaj Bansali is a MD Pediatrics qualified from Wadia Hospital, Mumbai, and he has done his fellowship in pediatric nephrology from St. John's Medical College, Bangalore. He is associated with Orchard Pediatric Super Specialty Clinic, and he is associated with many other hospitals at Aurangabad. Over to Dr. Pankaj to deliver his talk on approach to a child with proteinuria.
Yeah.
Dr. Pankaj, you are not heard. Yeah, you can start. Now you are heard.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank Dr. Namalwar sir, Dr. Kalavani ma'am, and IPNA for making this a great event possible where everybody is getting benefited out of it. Today, I'll be speaking about approach to a child with proteinuria. It was somewhere around 250 years back where Hippocrates found that bubbles on the top of urine is related with kidney problems. And then it was found that all those bubbles were because of protein leak in the urine. And now it has been proven beyond doubt that protein leak in the urine is a clue to renal parenchymal injury. Even if it is in a smaller quantity, mild quantity, it can be an early sign of kidney diseases. Not only that, it is a clue to kidney disease, but proteinuria itself has an important role in progression of kidney disease. And as a nephrologist, we all know that we are really running behind proteinuria to control it, to decrease it. Now look at these three bottles. On the left, from left to right, on the left, it is hematuria. The second bottle is showing a lot of bubbles on the top of urine. That is a marker for proteinuria. And the last, it's showing hematuria with proteinuria. And sequentially, these three have worsening prognosis. Like isolated hematuria can be subtle, but when there is a proteinuria, it is significantly abnormal. And when proteinuria is associated with hematuria, it is definitely a danger sign. But at the same time, there is another spectrum where we can have isolated asymptomatic proteinuria, that it has been detected accidentally when we screen urine for some other tests. It has been found in a lot of studies ranging from 4 to 6% of adolescent population can have some amount of proteinuria. But good thing is that most of them are transient and only less than 1 persist. What does that mean? Only less than 1% has persistence of this proteinuria beyond 3 months, where we label it as a persistent proteinuria. So it is important for us to differentiate whether it's a benign harmless proteinuria or whether it is a clinically significant pathological proteinuria where we need to reach the diagnosis and treat accordingly. Now, where does this protein leaks from? We all know it's a glomerular filtration barrier. It composed of endothelial cells on the blood side, then glomerular basement membrane, and epithelial cells with food process and slit diaphragm. And across this membrane, there are a lot of factors having interplay. Glomerular plasma blood flow rate, hydrostatic pressure on glomerular side as well as filtrate side, oncotic pressure, size and charge of molecules that can leak through this glomerular basement membrane, and intrinsic property of capillary walls. So all these factors has interplay before concluding how much amount of protein can be leaked through filtration barrier. Generally, only a molecular weight of less than 20,000 can pass easily across the glomerular filtration barrier, and the amount that will be passed depends inversely according to the size and negative charge, because there is an inherent negativity over the membrane of glomerular filtration barrier, so they will repel negative charged molecule, particularly like albumin. Normally, almost the urine that leaks protein, most of it constitutes of Tam-Horsfall protein, only 50% constitutes albumin, and remaining are other proteins like lysosome, immunoglobulins, lot of other hormones, and microglobulin. Here, proximal tubular cells has very important role. Whatever amount of protein is filtered in filtration, most of it is reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubular cells, epithelials. The high energy demand is, the energy requirement is very high because proximal cells are continuously working in reabsorption of all these protein. So that is why they are very vulnerable also. So any insult like ischemia, metabolic dysfunction, lot of toxins like drugs, they can harm this proximal tubule because already it is under a lot of stress of reabsorption. And that is why any proteinuria, whether it's in diabetes, in hypertension, they can affect these proximal cells and sequentially lead to tubulointerstitial inflammation and the chronic problem associated with protein leak. Now, in this topic, we are going to see when do we label it as a proteinuria, how do we classify and subtype it, how do we measure proteinuria, and we'll go through case illustrations to understand the disease. What is proteinuria? In adult, 24-hour urinary protein showing more than 150 milligram in a day or albumin more than 30 milligram in a day is labeled as proteinuria. Generally, commonly what we encounter is nephrotic syndrome, and nephrotic range proteinuria is labeled when proteinuria crosses 3 gram in a day or albumin more than 2.2 gram in a day. But as in pediatrics, everything we calculate according to weight. So less than 4 milligram per meter square per hour is considered as normal amount of protein. So this much amount of protein can normally every child leak in his urine. If it is more than 4 milligram, it is pathological. But to reach it at a nephrotic level, it should be more than 40 milligram per meter square. So the range in between 4 to 40 is pathological but non-nephrotic. And this is the group where we need to have proper approach so that we don't over investigate and at the same time we don't miss important pathological abnormality. There are different methods of measuring protein, can be qualitative or quantitative. In qualitative, we have heat coagulation, sulfosalicylic acid, and deep stick, while in quantitative, 24-hour urinary protein quantification and spot urinary protein or albumin creatinine ratio. These are the old tests where heat coagulation and sulfosalic acid test was very commonly used, and still a lot of centers do practice it. In heat coagulation, we heat the test tube at the top of column of urine, and we consider bottom of the urine as a control. With heat, the protein precipitate, but the unaccepted fact is along with protein, there are a lot of other things getting precipitated like phosphate, sulfate, carbonate. So we need to dissolve that, and for dissolving those phosphates or sulfate, we add glacial acetic acid. So after adding glacial acetic acid, whatever precipitate remain behind is protein. While in sulfosalic acid test, we add 3 drops of 20% sulfosalicylic acid. And then we see this range of proteinuria starting from trace to 4+. I won't say it as exactly qualitative test, but we can consider it as a semi-quantitative, because in this also we will see a range of proteinuria from trace to 4+. But with availability of deep stick method, the cumbersome ways to heat the test tube are arranged for sulfosalicylic acid, which is not also easily available everywhere. Deep stick has come really handy. Now, if we see these previous two tests, sulfosalicylic acid test or heat coagulation, they measure total protein in the urine. So they don't differentiate between albumin and other low molecular weight protein, while deep stick exclusively measures only measures albumin in the urine. Deep stick is a colorimetric test between tetrabromophenols blue and albumin. It causes color shading depending on albumin concentration in the urine. Proteinuria, especially albuminuria, has to be interpreted with caution in patients with gross variation of urine pH and specific gravity, because if pH is highly alkaline, it can cause false positive, and if pH is highly acidic, it can be false negative. Same thing, concentrated urine can give false positive test, while dilute urine can give false negative test. And if it is contaminated with antiseptics, particularly chlorhexidine, or mixed with blood, pus, or other secretions, it can also turn to be false positive. Otherwise, for a routine practical test and follow-up, this remains a very good test. Now, 24-hour urinary protein is considered as a gold standard. Here, it measures all types of protein. So it doesn't differentiate, most of the labs, they don't differentiate between albumin, protein, and low molecular weight protein. If we are in doubt whether this 24-hour urinary protein is albumin or low molecular weight protein, we can go ahead with urine protein electrophoresis, but it is rarely required because overall clinical condition and other lab parameters do point clearly whether we are dealing with tubular proteinuria or glomerular proteinuria. So the use of urine protein electrophoresis to differentiate between glomerular and tubular is rarely required. But in pediatrics, it's particularly a child less than 3 years of age, it becomes practically difficult, compliance becomes problem to collect 24-hour urine, because if mother misses 2 or 3 samples, our 24-hour estimation will not be a valid. So that's why then came role of urinary protein to creatinine ratio or urinary albumin to creatinine ratio. Most important thing, it should be collected as a first morning sample so that physiologically increased protein leak, which is seen in orthostatic proteinuria, will not misinterpret our report. So first morning sample should be collected. Urine albumin creatinine ratio is quite sensitive, particularly for glomerular injury, while urine protein creatinine ratio can be used for follow-up because PCR is easily available even in peripheral labs, and cost is also less as compared to albumin creatinine ratio. Here only pitfall is it is dependent on muscle mass of the patient. So if we have a cachectic patient where muscle mass is low, so creatinine excretion in the urine will be low, so it will overestimate, while if it is a bulky patient with huge muscle mass, it may underestimate. Now the question remains, what shall we prefer, PCR or albumin creatinine ratio? Most of the studies which were done in CKD or diabetes or hypertension, they have used albumin creatinine ratio as an initial marker. But a lot of studies have proven that except at extremes of protein leak, that means when protein leak is very minimal, somewhere below 50 milligram in a day, or very huge, somewhere about 5 gram in a day, in between range, both of them correlate well, runs parallel to each other. So unless we are finding out minimal amount of protein leak, most of the time, both of them can be used interchangeably. But a lot of definitions use albumin creatinine ratio, like in CKD or in diabetes. So we may go in favor of albumin creatinine ratio. How do we grade amount of proteinuria? As I have already told, less than 4 is physiological, more than 40 is nephrotic range, and in between 4 to 40 is pathological but non-nephrotic range. While in protein creatinine ratio, less than 0.2 is normal, more than 2 is nephrotic, and 0.2 to 2 is pathological non-nephrotic range, and this range needs to be worked up properly. There are a lot of factors which affect protein excretion, and one of the most important is age. Neonates' proximal tubules are not well matured, so the reabsorption of proximal tubular cells, epithelial cells, is not adequate. So the protein excretion can be seen almost up to 300 milligram per meter square in a day in early age, and it reaches less than 150 milligram, which is adult value, by adolescent. If we see a child, neonate, infant less than 6 months of age, 24-hour urinary protein estimation, even up to 8 milligram per meter square, has been proved to be normal. While protein creatinine ratio, the adult value of 0.2 is reached by 2 years. So in between 6 months to 2 years, even 0.5 up to 0.5 can be considered as a normal protein creatinine ratio. And there are a lot of risk factors which in the neonatal age, which increases risk of proteinuria, not only in early age, but even in adult population. These factors need to be kept in mind, and if neonate has these risk factor, they should be followed up. These are severe oligohydramnias, particularly starting from second trimester, significant IUGR, perinatal insult like hypoxia, acute kidney injury, and even a lot of maternal drugs consumed particularly in second or third trimester also can cause renal dysfunction, decrease glomerular number, and have a risk of proteinuria in the future. So if any of these factors are present, these neonates should be followed up and annually should be monitored for blood pressure, proteinuria, and serum creatinine level. Now, this is a simple diagram which will help us in understanding what are the different types of proteinuria. Amongst that, glomerular, tubular are commonly observed. Overflow proteinuria, little uncommon in pediatric population. And while secretory proteinuria is a more of a theoretical consideration, but practically it does not have significance in management. We'll see these one by one. What is glomerular proteinuria? In glomerular proteinuria, there is an increased glomerular capillary permeability. So the filtration barrier leaks huge amount of albumin particularly, and that proximal convoluted tubules are still working to reabsorb it, but it is beyond their capacity. So significant amount will be leaked in the urine. Here we see large molecular weight protein leaked in the urine, which we see commonly in nephrotic syndrome, that is albuminuria. Now, glomerular proteinuria, as we have seen, more than 4 milligram is pathological, but more than 40 is nephrotic range. And whenever we see a nephrotic range proteinuria, we cannot wait for evaluation. These children require immediate evaluation, diagnosis, and aggressive management. But if it is in between non-nephrotic range, then we can follow up this child. And if it persists for more than 3 months, then definitely we need to evaluate. This I am talking about isolated proteinuria. But if along with proteinuria, child have other complaints like hypertension, hematuria, or renal dysfunction, then we cannot wait for 3 months. We need to evaluate there only. Here, concept microalbuminuria. This concept has came with evaluation of diabetic nephropathy. They have found that despite normal proteinuric level, in early stage of diabetes, we see leak of albumin. And this cannot be easily picked up by dipstick test. So we started evaluating for microalbuminuria, and the range of microalbuminuria is 30 to 300 milligram. So less than 30, we consider it as a normal, and more than 300, we consider it as a significantly abnormal. So this range, where we label it as microalbuminuria, is an important early marker for kidney diseases, particularly in diabetes, in CKD, and hypertension, along with systemic vascular endothelial cell dysfunctions. So a lot of vasculitis can leak protein and start with small amount, which may not be picked up by dipstick or protein creatinine ratio. And it has been proven beyond doubt that microalbuminuria is an independent predictor of poor cardiovascular and renal outcome, irrespective of the primary cause, whether it's a hypertension, diabetes, obesity. Microalbuminuria itself is an independent predictor. When microalbuminuria crosses 300 milligram, that we label as a macroalbuminuria, here proteinuria and albuminuria parallels each other. So at this point, we can measure proteinuria also. But when it is in a smaller quantity, microalbuminuria plays very important role for follow-up. Now, as we have seen in nephrotic syndrome, they leak large molecular weight protein. The leak is at two levels. One is at slit diaphragm. Slit diaphragm work as a size barrier, so it filters protein according to size. While second is charge barrier. Here it works on all three levels, like heparan sulfate at endothelium, negative charge of GBM, and sialoprotein at epithelial cells. They are negatively charged barrier. So they have inherent capacity to repel back albumin to decrease its leak in the filtrate. But these barriers are affected in nephrotic syndrome. That's why in nephrotic syndrome, we leak predominantly negatively charged protein, even if they are of large sized. Now, tubular proteinuria. Here, the amount of protein present in the blood, amount of protein passing through the glomerular filtration barrier is normal. But where it needs to be absorbed, that is proximal tubular epithelium, that is affected. So that's why the absorption is affected, and all all filtered protein will be passed in the urine. Here we don't see significant albumin leak, rather it is a low molecular weight protein leak, and that constitutes beta-2 microglobulin, alpha-1 microglobulin, immunoglobulins, hormones like insulin, parathyroid hormone, growth hormone. Most of the time, tubular proteinuria is not very high range. It generally never reaches nephrotic range. So it will be somewhere around 1 plus to 2 plus, and always will be less than 1 gram in a day or less than 40 milligram per meter square per hour. They are not associated with edema. They never have hypoproteinemia. And the good thing, most of them will have other manifestations of proximal tubular dysfunction in the form of glycosuria, phosphaturia, sometimes calciuria, and most importantly can have bicarbonate wastage also. The prototype which we see is Fanconi's anemia. If we are in doubt, here urine protein electrophoresis can be of use to differentiate whether it is predominantly albumin peak or whether it is a low molecular like beta-2 microglobulin or immunoglobulin peak. Now here is overflow proteinuria, relatively uncommon condition seen predominantly when we encounter with myoglobinuria, hemoglobinuria, where already we have some setting for that. Here the protein, excess amount of protein is present in the blood. So excess amount is filtered through filtration barrier. Proximal tubules are working extra, but still they are not able to absorb everything, and then it leaks through the urine. So overflow proteinuria is relatively more common in adult, where multiple myeloma is considered as a prototype for it. Secretory proteinuria occurs due to increased excretion of tissue protein, particularly it is from uroepithelium, seen commonly with UTI and analgesic nephropathy. Practically, it is not of very high level. It is a not very long lasting and not pathological. Once disease is under control, it will resolve by itself. Just a diagram showing urine electrophoresis. If we see bottom left, there is a peak at the albumin level, which is seen classically in nephrotic syndrome, while in second right-sided bottom, there is a peak in the gamma globulin level, which is seen in multiple myeloma. These are the diagrammatic representation, but actually what we see are the strips where those charge is applied and the protein travel according to the strips. On the right upper side, which shows tubular proteinuria at the gamma globulin level, while glomerular at the albumin spectrum, and mixed can have all picture altogether. Let us start with common cases. I think looking at case itself, most of us have reached conclusion. What is the diagnosis? It's a 3.5-year boy presented with anasarca. Investigation had shown urine protein 4 plus, creatinine of 0.5, low albumin, high cholesterol. I think most of us don't have any doubt in our mind about the diagnosis and type of proteinuria. So it's a glomerular cause of proteinuria. There are a lot of other causes along with nephrotic syndrome where we see glomerular proteinuria like FSGS, IgA nephropathy, MPGN, membranous, hereditary causes like Alpert's, acquired diseases, particularly heavy metal poisoning, secondary causes like lupus, HSP. What I want to focus here is reflux nephropathy and hyperfiltration injury. If child has decreased number of nephrons, the extra burden is brought by remaining nephrons. So practically the GFR of individual nephron is increased. So they are under subject of high pressure, and that leads to hyperfiltration injury. So decreased number of nephrons, whether it is because of hypoplasia, dysplasia, whether it is because of reflux nephropathy, all of them can lead to glomerular proteinuria. And why it is important to subclassify under glomerular proteinuria? Because we have medications in the form of ACE inhibitors or ARBs where proteinuria can be decreased up to a certain level, and that will delay progression of kidney disease. Second case, in nephrotic syndrome, in glomerular cause of proteinuria, which test shall we prefer? Now in the diagnosis, here I have mentioned only 4 plus. Do we need to quantify protein? Now according to definition, presence of 4 plus on urine sticks along with hypoalbuminemia and hypercholesterolemia and edema, it's sufficient to diagnose. On follow-up, but definitely I will like to prove that child has went in remission. So at diagnosis, I will like to get a definite quantification of urinary protein and because that will help me in follow-up whether that has resolved completely. So once we have proven that it is a minimal change, once we have proven that it is a steroid sensitive nephrotic syndrome, then further follow-up it's sufficient with urine albumin sticks, but at least initially I will suggest to confirm remission by quantifying urinary protein. Now we have a second case, a 5-year-old child who presented with failure to thrive, polyuria, polydipsia, normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, hypophosphaturia, and here protein creatinine ratio is 1.5. Now again it looks like quite straightforward case because there are a lot of features to suggest you tubular dysfunction in the form of failure to thrive, polyuria, polydipsia, along with normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Now this is classical proteinuria of tubular origin where protein creatinine ratio is high, but when we check on albumin sticks, it shows negative because the protein leaked in the urine is not of albumin origin, but it is other low molecular weight protein. So this is a tubular type of proteinuria, and this can be encountered particularly in hereditary tubulopathy, Fanconi syndrome, other causes like interstitial nephritis, cystic kidney disease, shock, and even recovering acute tubular necrosis also can have this type of proteinuria. So sometimes while recovering ATN, we can see mild metabolic acidosis with leak of protein in the urine. Now these two were simple straightforward cases. Now let us come to the scenario where we need to apply our physiology and evaluate them. A 5-year-old boy presented with high-grade fever of 2 days duration, normal vitals, no systemic findings, no edema, and urine microscopy showed 2+ protein. Now, shall we consider significant? Shall we evaluate or shall we wait? Here we need to differentiate whether it's a symptomatic or asymptomatic. If child has any of the symptoms in the form of edema, hematuria, hypertension, renal dysfunction, or systemic features like rash, arthritis, and there is a significant family history, this child requires further evaluation. But if clinically child does not have any of these features, only accidentally we have detected urinary protein of 2+, we can follow up this child. Once fever has resolved, we can repeat his urine examination. Why? Because there is an entity called transient proteinuria. It can be seen during high-grade fever, heavy exercise, stress, conversion, dehydration. All these can lead to transient proteinuria. Generally, this is a glomerular origin of proteinuria, and it does not exceed 2+ and never above 1 gram per day. And there is no underlying kidney disease, does not require any treatment, and it resolves by itself once the obvious stress has subsided. So that's why we followed up this child. On follow-up, urine albumin was still 1+, RBC is nil. Now what shall we do? Shall we evaluate further? Before evaluation, let us understand another term, orthostatic proteinuria. What is it? The word itself says orthostatic means the protein leak varies according to the position of the patient. It is a sort of exaggerated form of physiological proteinuria, particularly found in adolescent age in thin, tall person. Here, the amount of protein that is passed in the urine in supine position is normal, while in upright position, particularly in the evening hours, protein excretion may increase almost up to 10-fold, but is always less than 1 gram. If we collect 24-hour protein, it will be always less than 1 gram. So how shall we differentiate? How shall we diagnose this condition? A simple way, if urine protein is positive and we do a early morning, first morning urine sample, it shows normal protein creatinine ratio. It confirms orthostatic proteinuria. So if early morning urine is normal, we can ignore this proteinuria, considering it as an orthostatic. But yes, we shall keep on this patient because few studies have shown that with time it may worsen. So maybe once a year proteinuria documentation is sufficient. Most of them don't cause significant problem. This child followed after 1 month, again presented with fever, received medication. Here urine albumin was again 2+. Now this time we have shown RBCs 4 to 5 with normal renal function and no other obvious feature pointing towards renal disorder. Now what are the probabilities? One probability I can definitely think of is drug induced, because a lot of drugs including even paracetamol, mefenamic acid or ibugesic can cause some amount of proteinuria and RBCs by interstitial nephritis. So once we pick up these findings, we should not ignore this report, but after resolution of fever, again followed up. This time, urine albumin was still persistent, 2 plus RBCs were there. Now here, we don't have isolated proteinuria. Now we have proteinuria associated with RBCs in the urine. So we need to quantify protein, and with quantification, 24-hour urine protein revealed 1.3 gram. So we proceeded with biopsy, and it turned out to be IgA nephropathy. So in short, if we have non-nephrotic pathological proteinuria and no other complaints, no other features on creatinine, hematuria, hypertension, we can follow up this child. How long? Almost we can follow up till 1 year. But if child develops any of the added features like hematuria, worsening of proteinuria, hypertension, then child should be evaluated, and if required, child should be subjected for kidney biopsy. This is the flow chart, a simplified way which I have tried to explain. If urine albumin is more than 1 plus, repeat urine routine 4 weekly. If it still shows more than 1 plus, we can quantify by urinary protein creatinine ratio in early morning sample. If it is less than 0.2, there is a high probability of orthostatic proteinuria. Just follow up this patient, keep on follow up. But if it is more than 0.2, we shall go ahead with 24-hour urinary protein estimation. If it is more than 1 gram, then straight away it means there is a high amount of proteinuria and child needs further evaluation. But if it is in between 300 milligram to 1 gram, we need to evaluate rather than proceeding for biopsy. What evaluation we'll see in next slides. If all those investigations are normal, we can just follow up. We can wait and monitor up to 1 year. If proteinuria is rising or any other features, which I am telling again and again, is like hematuria, hypertension, deranged KFT or rising creatinine, child should be subjected for biopsy. But at initial investigation itself, if we find some abnormality, child should be considered and referred for biopsy. Now, what are the clinical findings we are looking for? Hematuria, whether gross or microscopic. Associated edema, hypertension, oliguria, to look for glomerulonephritis, whether there are different types of AGN which can present with edema, hypertension, oliguria. If there are associated polyuria, to look for tubular defects, lower urinary tract symptoms, palpable abdominal lump for cystic kidneys, deafness, visual defect for Alpert's, systemic features like rash, joint pain, fever for systemic diseases like lupus, HSP, failure to thrive, anemia, bony deformities, pointers for CKD. And if it is in smaller children, particularly neonatal age, look for maternal diabetes, eclampsia, or drug history in the mother, particularly NSAIDs or enalaprils. In the lab evaluation, we shall go for urine examination, because not only for quantifying protein, but even look for RBCs in the urine, renal function, and other serological tests when we are having any of these abnormality. DMSA scan, particularly when we are expecting reflux nephropathy. So if all these evaluations are normal, we can follow up with repeated urine albumin. And if any of this is abnormal, according to abnormality, we have to proceed for further evaluation. Now, another case, a 7-year-old boy presented with nocturnal enuresis, but on evaluation noticed to have polyuria. And when we went in detail, he had history suggestive of recurrent UTI. He was short-statured with blood hypertension, and investigations had revealed significant amount of protein link in the urine, along with creatinine 1.1, which is actually quite high for a 7-year-old child. Further evaluation showed bilateral PCS fullness, pelvic calyceal system fullness, and bilateral reflux. Now this case, probably we are responsible for his worsening. We means all of us who have treated this patient, because recurrent UTI with reflux should not proceed to this stage. But now what? Here there is already creatinine is rising and there is significant protein leak. So this is a reflux nephropathy. And as I have said, it is because of hyperfiltration injury secondary to nephron loss. The initial change that follows reduced nephron number is an increase in single nephron GFR. This results in sustained increase in pressure in this nephron. Hyperfiltration is hypothesized to be a precursor of intraglomeralular hypertension leading to albuminuria. GFR then falls progressively in parallel with rise in albuminuria, which in long term can lead to end-stage renal disease. So it is important to pick up this albuminuria and treat with ACE inhibitors or ARBs so that at least the speed of progression of CKD will be halted or decreased. So remember, all patients with structural abnormalities of kidney and urinary tract should be monitored for proteinuria and hypertension, because probably whatever damage has incurred, we can't change that, but further damage we can slow down so that child will have a long life without need of progressing to end-stage renal disease. Last case, a 6-month-old male child. Posterior urethral wall was fulgurated in newborn period. On follow-up, it had shown bilateral echogenic kidneys with partial loss of CMD, and there is already polyuria and polydipsia. Urine microscopy was normal. Now remember, this child has polyuria, polydipsia, so specific gravity is quite low. In this scenario, urinary albumin or urinary protein may not be evident in normal urine examination, but when we do urinary protein creatinine ratio, it turned out to be quite high, 2.5. This is the fallacy of protein creatinine ratio. This is fallacy of urine albustics, where diluted urine may miss significant amount of protein. So that's why when we are following up these patients, rather than relying on just simple urine routine, we shall follow up with urine protein creatinine ratio, particularly when we are already seeing echogenic kidneys, partially rising creatinine, loss of CMD, and a significant history of polyuria, that means tubular dysfunction. It is better to follow with protein creatinine ratio, and if required, we can consider ACE inhibitors to decrease amount of leak of protein in the urine. When shall we go ahead with kidney biopsy? If it is a significant proteinuria more than 1 gram or persistent proteinuria associated with urinary sediments, hematuria, hypertension, elevated creatinine, which is showing decrease in GFR, persistent low C3 for more than 3 months, positive family history, and any clinical or serological evidence of vasculitis, we shall proceed with kidney biopsy. Now, we have all seen that proteinuria is a precursor of progressive glomerular damage. Proteinuria is not only clue to glomerular damage, but also proteinuria itself can lead to worsening of the renal function. Here, the dysfunction of the glomerular capillary barrier leads to abnormal passage of large amount of plasma protein across glomerular capillary wall, causing further glomerular insult. Now, more protein is leaked, more protein burden reaches proximal tubular epithelial cells. So PCT cells are working extra. So there is a lot of protein overload inside the cells, and this itself initiate inflammation cascade activation and interstitial inflammation and fibrosis. So this second part is considered as an important reason for glomerulosclerosis, where proteinuria itself damages PCT, causes inflammation, and further worsens glomerular function. How for individual disease, we are not going in detail about individual disease, how do we manage nephrotic or SLE, but in general, when we see persistent non-nephrotic range proteinuria, what we need is follow-up. Follow-up with blood pressure monitoring, urine assessment, and creatinine value. If everything is normal, there is no need of dietary restriction, no need to restrict salt or protein, but yes, excess intake of sodium and protein shall be avoided. We are not saying that we shall restrict it. Let child have his normal diet, but excess should be avoided. And ACE inhibitors and ARBs can be used here. They work as both antiproteinuric and nephroprotective. How does this work? The fall in proteinuria is related to decrease in renal vascular resistance, particularly of post-glomerular arteriolar vessels. So post-glomerular vasodilation will lead in fall in intraglomerular capillary pressure. So the filtration of protein will consequently decrease. At the same time, podocyte is also considered to be an important site of action. by prevention of permiselective dysfunction at the slit diaphragm. And angiotensin 2 is believed to play a central role in fibrogenesis. So ACE inhibitors work at that level also and delay or slow the fibrogenesis induced by excessive protein leak. So these are the different ways, different points where ACE inhibitors and ARBs work. Now new drug renin inhibitor like aliskiren has been also shown to have good effect or control of proteinuria. To summarize, proteinuria could be a harbinger of potential renal issue. So it is important to evaluate everywhere when and where we are suspecting renal dysfunction or probable renal insult. Symptomatic proteinuria calls for immediate investigation and treatment, while asymptomatic, non-orthostatic, non-nephrotic proteinuria warrants careful follow-up. Initiation of treatment at early stages will retard progression of renal disease. So documentation and further treatment plan is very important in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj Bansali, for taking us through the approach of proteinuria. It was a theory come clinical oriented with a lot of case scenarios. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Namalva sir, do you have any other comments to add, sir? Namalva sir? Probably sir is not there. So we'll move on to the next presentation. The next talk is on hematuria. The next talk is on microscopic hematuria. How do we approach? So we'll be running through these aspects. How do we recognize and confirm hematuria? And what is the site of origin of hematuria, whether it is renal or non-renal? If it is renal, whether it is glomerular hematuria or non-glomerular hematuria? And what are all the etiologies which can cause hematuria? And how do we recognize for early referral? So you can broadly classify hematuria into gross hematuria and microscopic hematuria. Gross hematuria is something which is self-explanatory. The blood is seen with the naked eye. And microscopic hematuria can be detected by dipstick, and the confirmatory is by microscopy. And it needs to be always be performed in a freshly voided urine sample. It is a clean catch urine sample. Though there are no consensus to define microscopic hematuria, it is considered as significant only when you have 5 RBCs or more than 5 RBCs per high power field. So the laboratory test for hematuria can be by dipstick or urine microscopy. In dipstick, dipstick utilizes basically the the peroxidase activity of hemoglobin and myoglobin. And if it is present, it produces a green-blue color. And in microscopy, you need to have minimum 10 ml of urine, and it need to be centrifuged for 5 minutes, probably 2000 rotations per minute. The supernatant and resuspend the sediment, and it has to be examined in a high power field, and you need to count minimum 20 fields, and the average of the report is considered as positive, and it is positive only when you have 5 or more RBCs per high power field. It can also be read as RBCs per millimeter cube. For that, you need to place an uncentrifuged urine in a counting chamber. That is a Newbar's counting chamber, which is used to count for RBCs and WBC, and read and report the results as RBC per millimeter cube. And that is also considered positive only when you have more than 5 RBCs per millimeter cube. So how do we differentiate hematuria, myoglobinuria, and hemoglobinuria? When the dipstick is negative and you have absence of RBC by microscopy, it is false hematuria. You can have false hematuria and when you have ingestion of few drugs like rifampicin, pyridium, or food processes which has a dye in it, which can cause reddish urine. And next is to confirm hemoglobinuria or myoglobinuria, you will have a positivity by dipstick, but there will be absence of RBCs in urine microscopy. And to confirm true hematuria, the urine dipstick will be positive and the urine microscopy also will be positive for RBCs. So now we have differentiated the hemoglobinuria, myoglobinuria, and true hematuria. Next step would be whether the hematuria is transient or it is a persistent hematuria. So to consider it as persistent hematuria, you need to have 5 RBCs per high power field in 3 consecutive centrifuge specimen, and it should be done at least 1 week apart. And it is always recommended that you should have at least 2 of the urine analysis, which is done at least 2 to 3 weeks apart to actually to indicate that it is microhematuria. And if it is positive, it is mandatory that you subject the child for further evaluation. These are the few causes of transient hematuria. It can be caused by exercise, febrile disorders, gastroenteritis with dehydration, contamination from external genitalia, drugs, and trauma. And why we need to know whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular? It not only helps us to prognosticate, it also helps us to optimize the subsequent diagnostic evaluation. So we need to have few clues to differentiate whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular. So how do we differentiate them? The first thing what we need to look for is the shape of the RBCs, whether the RBCs are normal or dysmorphic, the presence of RBC cast, which is more in favor for glomerular hematuria, presence of proteins, whether it is less than 2 plus or more than 2 plus. More than 2 plus is towards glomerular hematuria, presence of white blood cells, and presence of crystals. And the next test will be the urine analysis, where it will help us to differentiate whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular. In glomerular, you will have a cola-colored urine. You can have a significant proteinuria that is more than 2 plus, and it is always associated with RBC cast, and you will have dysmorphic RBCs, which is more than 20%. And in non-glomerular, the urine per se will be an red urine, and the proteinuria will be present, but it never exceeds more than 2 plus. And despite having gross hematuria, it doesn't exceed 2 plus, and it is not associated with RBC cast. You can have positivity for nitrates and leukocyte esterase. And we should always remember, like in glomerular hematuria, you can have 20% of dysmorphic RBCs, and something which is very much specific for glomerular hematuria is presence of acanthocytes. This is a picture which depicts in a phase contrast microscope. These are the acanthocytes, which is already marked. It is a ring-shaped cell which has a vesicular projection, something like a bleb-like projection. These are called as acanthocytes. And in 20% of dysmorphic RBCs, if you have more than 5% of acanthocytes, it is even more specific for glomerular hematuria. And the next picture is on your right is it is suggestive of non-glomerular hematuria. This is also seen in a phase contrast microscopy, where the red blood cells have uniform size and shape. In one of the cause for glomerular hematuria, which is hypercalciuria, can also be associated with dysmorphic RBCs, but they usually do not have red cell cast. So you need to know few hints which will help us to differentiate whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular hematuria. So these are the few things we'll be running through. We need to know the history, physical examination, urine analysis, and the laboratory testing. So what are all the clues we get from the history? So if it is a glomerular hematuria, it can be associated with oliguria, where we can see in post-infective glomerular nephritis, or it can be a rapidly progressive glomerular nephritis, and it can be associated with respiratory, skin, or gastrointestinal infections. in case of IgA nephropathy, deafness, family history of hearing loss or renal failure, which is commonly seen with Alport syndrome, rashes, joint pain and swelling, which is associated with SLE and HSP, and hemoptysis, which is seen in Goodpasture syndrome, and few other vasculitis. And histories towards non-glomerular causes, or you can have dysuria or polyuria. You can have renal colic or abdominal pain, which is commonly seen in renal stone disease. You can have fever in case of acute pyelonephritis. You can have few medication exposures, history of trauma, and there will be a strong family history of sickle cell disease, hemophilia, or von Willebrand disease. And even strenuous exercise can cause hematuria. And so what are all the clues in physical examination do you get? Towards glomerular hematuria, usually children with glomerular hematuria usually present with hypertension, with edema, rashes, arthritis, and anemia. In non-glomerular, usually children are normotensive. They can present with suprapubic pain, and the signs of trauma might be present. And in the laboratory urine analysis, I think we have already covered in the previous slides. And next, the laboratory testing is to differentiate. How do we differentiate glomerular from non-glomerular? Is usually glomerular disease will be elevated, might have elevated blood urea, nitrogen, or creatinine. They can have associated anemia. They can have a azo positivity, and they can present with abnormal complement levels. Whereas in non-glomerular hematuria, usually they present with a normal renal function test. So next, moving on to the etiology of hematuria. The common causes of non-glomerular hematuria can be renal parenchymal disease, it can be a vascular malformation, it can be a metabolic cause or infectious cause. In renal parenchymal disease, we have hydronephrosis, we can have polycystic kidney disease. In vascular malformation, we have the renal vein thrombosis, sickle cell disease, hypercalciuria and hyperuricosuria in case of metabolic causes. In infections, you can have cystitis, pyelonephritis, and tuberculosis. The common etiologies of glomerular hematuria is you can divide them as primary glomerulonephritis, secondary glomerulonephritis, or familial cause. The commonest primary glomerulonephritis, which can present with glomerular hematuria or post-infective glomerulonephritis, IgA nephropathy. You can have membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis. You can have focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. And in secondary glomerulonephritis, you have the lupus nephritis, you have our HSP and HUS. In familial, the common causes are Alport syndrome and thin basement membrane disease, which is also called as familial hematuria. So the next thing is, like any child who is presenting with red urine, you need to analyze the urine. First, you need to confirm whether it is true hematuria or false hematuria. So do a urine analysis. If there are no RBCs, then it is pigmenturia, either myoglobinuria or hemoglobinuria. When you have significant RBCs, that is more than 5 RBCs per high power field, it confirms your hematuria. And in hematuria, you need to differentiate whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular. If it is glomerular, then you proceed with renal function test, that is your blood urea, creatinine, azo, C3. It all depends on your clinical examination and history. What are all the tests you need to proceed with? So if the test is consistent with post-infective glomerulonephritis, give the supportive treatment for hypertension, hyperkalemia, and azotemia. If it is a non-glomerular cause, then you need to do a blood urea, nitrogen, your creatinine, ultrasound abdomen, your serum calcium, calcium creatinine, urine calcium creatinine ratio, and 24 hours urine calcium. You also have to look whether you have any infectious cause. In case of acute pyelonephritis, then you have to treat as per protocol. If you don't find any obvious cause in renal function test in non-glomerular cause, then it means that you need to proceed with the next level of investigation, doing your complement levels. You need to do your C3, your C4, ANA, anti-dsDNA, and ultrasound. And only if it is required and mandatory, you need to proceed with renal biopsy. If you have a surgical causes, you need to refer to the pediatric surgeon or urologist. This flow chart is just a continuity of the previous flow chart. That is, when you have a hematuria, you need to first understand whether you confirm your hematuria. Next, you need to differentiate whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular. If it is glomerular, you need to do the renal function test. And you need to, the best thing you need to do is you need to find out whether it is confined only to your renal system or it is a multi-system disease. If it is confined only to your renal system and you have a low C3 levels, then it is more in favor of post-infective glomerulonephritis. You can have membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis, or it can be a shunt nephritis or endocarditis. When you have an isolated renal disease with normal C3 levels, then it is in favor of IgA nephropathy, Alport syndrome, thin basement membrane disease, and pauciimmune glomerulonephritis. You do the renal function test and you find it is you have a multi-system involvement and you have a low C3 levels, then it means your the diagnosis is towards your SLE and atypical HUS. And if you have a multi-system disease and you have a normal C3 levels, then your diagnosis is towards HSP or small vessel vasculitis, or it can be an anti-GBM disease, that is Goodpasture syndrome. So clinically, how do we categorize microscopic hematuria? So we categorize them as asymptomatic isolated microscopic hematuria, asymptomatic microhematuria with proteinuria, microhematuria with clinical symptoms, microhematuria with hypertension. So in asymptomatic isolated microhematuria, it requires a follow-up examination and a stepwise evaluation with a detailed family history, which will help us to diagnose Alport syndrome and benign familial microscopic hematuria. If it is an asymptomatic microhematuria with proteinuria, then it requires a rapid evaluation for glomerular, which is pertinent to glomerular disease, and it requires early referral to a nephrologist. When you have a microhematuria with clinical symptoms, that is when you have hypertension or edema with your microhematuria, then it requires emergency evaluation for glomerular and non-glomerular with early referral to the nephrologist. So the next category is microhematuria with hypertension. It requires rapid evaluation and early quick referral to the nephrologist. So in microhematuria, the red flag sign is whether the microhematuria is associated with presence or absence of proteinuria. There are a few other red flag signs. They are when the hematuria is associated with oliguria, when you have nephrotic range proteinuria, when it is associated with hypertension, when it is associated with renal failure, or when you have recurrent macroscopic hematuria. One second, I'll just zoom my slide. So when you have a isolated asymptomatic microscopic hematuria, you need to do repeat urine analysis, and it is very much mandatory that no exercise should be performed prior to giving the urine analysis, and you should give the urine analysis at least 2 samples a week apart. And you need to find out whether the hematuria is associated with proteinuria. If hematuria is persistent, you need to take a detailed clinical history and repeat your clinical examination as well. You need to check whether the child has got edema, hypertension. If the urine analysis is negative, you just have to keep the child under follow-up. If the history and clinical examination is normal, then you do a urine culture, and if it is positive, treat as per UTI guidelines, or any infection, you need to treat the infection first. If the urine culture is negative, then you have to follow up every 3 months with the history examination, and you need to do urine analysis and keep looking for RBC cast. And when you have a history and your clinical examination which is abnormal, then you have to follow the protocol of evaluation of symptomatic microhematuria. And if your follow-up after 3 months, if you have abnormal history examination or urine, when you have a normal history examination or urine analysis, and you have a persistent microscopic hematuria, then you need to keep evaluating them for look for calcium creatinine ratio, and you need to do a Doppler, and if necessary, you need to do a renal biopsy. So next, how do we approach asymptomatic microscopic hematuria with proteinuria? So when you have a child with asymptomatic microscopic hematuria with proteinuria, you need to measure the renal function test. The basic thing is measure your serum creatinine and quantify the amount of proteins lost in the urine. You need to do the 24 hours urine collection or do a first early morning urine sample and for urine protein creatinine ratio. Look, see whether you have an elevated serum creatinine, or when you have a proteins of more than 4 milligram proteins per meter square per hour, or when you have a urine protein to creatinine ratio of more than 0.2, then you need to refer to pediatric nephrologist. Early referral has to be given. When you have a protein, 24 hours urine protein, which is less than 4 milligram protein per meter square per hour, or when you have a protein of urine protein creatinine ratio of less than 0.2 milligram, then you need to repeat your urine analysis 2 to 3 weeks later. After 2 to 3 weeks, if you find the hematuria and proteinuria is persisting, it requires urgent evaluation. And if you find only hematuria, you need to follow up as per asymptomatic isolated microscopic hematuria protocol. When you have hematuria and proteinuria resolved, you just return to your routine pediatric care. And you should always remember, for children between 6 to 24 months, the threshold value is 0.5 milligram protein to milligram of creatinine, your protein creatinine ratio. So we just have one case discussion. It is a 12 years old boy who presented with history of passing cola colored urine, which was painless, and mother has found that the child has been having similar complaints for the past 2 years, and following each episode of respiratory tract infection. She also gives history of similar complaints in the maternal uncle. What would be the possible diagnosis you would think of? So subsequently, the child was evaluated, and further evaluation showed the creatinine with 0.7 milligram per deciliter. Electrolytes was pretty normal. You have a serum albumin of 3.6. Your cholesterol was normal. Your C3 complements was normal, and your urine albumin was 3+. Pus cells was 2 to 3, but it had a field full of RBCs. So renal biopsy was done, and which was suggestive of IgA nephropathy. The child had IgA deposits in the mesangial matrix. So what are the indications for renal biopsy when you have a child with hematuria? So the indications are when you have significant proteinuria, which was considered as one of the red flag sign. So when you have a significant proteinuria, which is more than 3+, or nephrotic syndrome per se, when you have gross hematuria, which is more than 4 weeks, or when you have a microscopic hematuria more than 18 to 24 months, when you are having an abnormal renal function test, out of proportion of volume depletion, or when you have a persistent hypertension, when you have a low complement levels, which is persistently low beyond 12 weeks, or when you have other systemic manifestations, and when you have abnormal ANA or anti-dsDNA, when you have a strong family history of end-stage renal disease or evidence of chronic renal disease, or when you have a systemic disease with significant proteinuria. So with this, the take-home message is any child who is presenting with asymptomatic microscopic hematuria in children is actually rare and associated and rarely associated with clinically important disease. Rarely asymptomatic microscopic hematuria can be the first sign of occult renal disease, and progression to clinically significant disease will be accompanied by development of either hypertension or proteinuria, which is considered as a red flag sign when the child is presenting with microscopic hematuria. And long-term follow-up of children with microscopic hematuria is really mandatory. And common clinical conditions can also present as microscopic hematuria. And the commonest etiologies we encounter are the idiopathic hypercalciuria, resolving infection-related GN, IgA nephropathy, and Alport syndrome. Thank you. Dr. Pankaj, you are there?
Yeah.
Next, we'll be having our polling sessions for the participants. You need to just hold on to take up the questions at the end of the session.
Okay.
Namal Vasa, do you have anything to add on, sir? So we'll go through the instructions for the polling sessions. The participants are requested to enter their proper email ID and contact number during the process of registration for the ease of future communication. And we are already done with one polling session. So totally we are left with 6 more polling sessions. And each polling session will have 20 questions, and it's mandatory to answer all the questions to proceed with the submission. And total duration for the polling session is 8 minutes. And we have 3 star questions in each session. And star questions are taken into consideration in case of tie. And the cumulative score of all 7 polling sessions will be taken as a final mark for selecting the winners. And only trainees are allowed to participate in the polling session. Request all the participants to log in on time using a bigger screen for easy viewing and answering. Once you log into the webinar, you can actually access the polling session. So now we can move on to the polling session. I request Dr. Pankaj kindly hold on for next 10 minutes because we'll be taking up the polling session. Yeah, I'll read out the questions for you. The first question is white discoloration of floor after child passes urine. What is a probable cause? You want to answer the question? White discoloration of the floor once a child passes urine. It is because of the phosphate in the urine.
Yeah, so
phosphorus which is present in the urine. It can,
phosphate crystals.
Yeah, that can cause white discoloration of over the floor once a child voids. And the next question is, in a children with CKD, should we monitor albumin or proteinuria? Albuminuria or proteinuria? Or there robust evidence in favor of importance of albuminuria in a children with CKD?
Sir, Rajesh
That question is from Dr. Rajesh Sinha. He has asked, in the children with CKD, should we monitor albuminuria or proteinuria? Are there any robust evidence favors of importance of albuminuria in children with CKD?
Sir, actually, this question still remains unanswered because a lot of studies have tried to prove whether albuminuria or proteinuria is superior to each other. As I have said, initial phase where we are seeing minimal proteinuria, albuminuria does play an important role. And the most important thing, most of our guidelines of CKD are following albuminuria. So for practical purpose, for initial stage, I think we shall recommend albuminuria. But if we assess theoretically, most of the range which we follow for these CKD patients, they both, albumin and protein, run parallel. At initial stage, it has been found that even proximal tubule function is altered in the cases with CKD. So the absorption of albumin may be disproportionately little higher in this population. So maybe proteinuria can prove a better marker to assess exact amount of protein leak. But practically, I think we will be following albuminuria because our all guidelines are dependent on that. And
yeah, even the KDIGO guidelines of categorizing CKD staging denotes albuminuria as A1, A2, A3.
Yes.
But for practical purpose, we still consider proteinuria as a better marker.
Yeah.
Namal Vasa, you're there. You have anything to add on, sir? Namal Vasa? Probably sir is not heard. He's probably muted. The next question is, thank you for your talk with the great clarity. How do we manage a child who presents with the diagnostic criteria of nephrotic syndrome with anasarca and not mere puffiness detected to have, the same child is detected to have reflex on MCU? Do you prefer to go for steroid trial? Will you avoid steroids in a child with nephrotic syndrome but with other CACUT, example malrotated ectopic kidneys, and will the choice change if creatinine is deranged?
Yes. Generally, the proteinuria which may be significant along with in reflux nephropathy, but it doesn't manifest up to the level that child will have full-blown picture of nephrotic syndrome in the form of edema, hypoalbuminemia, or hypercholesterolemia. So even if it is reflux and child presents with all features of nephrotic syndrome, we will prefer to give a trial of steroid before ignoring that proteinuria secondary to reflux nephropathy. Most of these proteinuria, glomerular proteinuria, secondary to hyperfiltration are not in the range of nephrotic or will rarely ever manifest with full-blown nephrotic picture. So definitely we shall give a trial of prednisolone. Now if creatinine is deranged, I think in setting of reflux nephropathy with classical nephrotic syndrome and deranged creatinine, we shall consider prednisolone, but I think the index of biopsy will be little low. So I will like to rule out any other significant glomerular lesion and start prednisolone.
Okay. When you have a deranged renal parameters without doing a biopsy, going ahead with just prednisolone
will not be a right option.
Will
so I think we shall go ahead with the biopsy. Yeah.
Okay. And as already mentioned in Dr. Pankaj's presentation, all these tubular proteinuria, which is caused by reflex nephropathy, usually they have a lot of proteinuria, but they never cause low serum albumins significant enough to cause nephrotic syndrome. I think Dr. Pankaj has answered your question well. Next question is, in transient proteinuria, protein 1 plus or 2 plus only, is it irrespective of age and illness?
Transient proteinuria is not related to illness. Transient proteinuria is secondary to increased changed vascular structure at the glomerular level. So irrespective of age or illness, it will be never more than 2 plus. So always it is 1 plus or at the most maximum 2 plus and will resolve with the initiating insult which has caused it, maybe fever, stress, or any other injury. So frankly, I didn't get the question clearly. Is it irrespective of age and illness?
Yeah, whether is there any age-specific criteria to say that in transient, as we have for urine protein creatinine ratio less than 0.2, more than 0.2, he's asking in transient proteinuria, is there any range to define?
No,
there is no range.
More than 2 plus is always considered abnormal. We will definitely like to quantify proteinuria in that scenario.
Okay, and the next question is, should we be checking UPCR in all our patients with PUV annually or as often as we review them?
I think annual checkup is sufficient. We don't need to review more frequently because it is not going to worsen very rapidly within 1 hour. So annual checkup is sufficient for this patient.
Okay. And the next question is...
Can we use ACE inhibitor in acute renal failure? No, definitely no, for 2 reasons. One, it will further drop down GFR and it increases risk of hyperkalemia also. So when creatinine is raised, not only in acute renal failure, even in CKD, ACE inhibitor should be used with cautious. And when we are starting ACE inhibitor, we should monitor for potassium and rise in creatinine after starting ACE inhibitor.
Okay, and the next question is, why membranous nephropathy, though having massive proteinuria clinically, has got less edema?
I don't think so.
Yeah, they present with the significant edema only. Yeah, they do present with significant edema. They present as nephrotic syndrome. Only when you evaluate and do a biopsy, you find out that it turns out to be membranous nephropathy. Otherwise, they present as any other nephrotic syndrome etiologies. And the next question is simplified and informative lecture on approach to proteinuria. It is a comment. And next question is how long we can observe use ACE then we decide to combine with ARBs as anti-proteinuric measure.
Okay, ACE
A
inhibitor first.
combination of ACE and ARBs.
ARBs, yeah. ACE inhibitor came very strongly with proteinuria associated with diabetic glomerulosclerosis. Then we added ARB, which has significantly improved proteinuria further. But when we added both together, even complication increased in the form of affected GFR, hyperkalemia, cough. All these problems were also anticipated. So few studies have even are not presently recommending both drugs combining together. Yes, combining them together does improve proteinuria, but even its side effects also increases with it. So that remains doubt. At what level shall we add? Ma'am, any take on this?
I think it should be used with caution. There are patients who are in combination with ACE and ARBs. It is just that you need to monitor the creatinine and look for hyperkalemia. It has to be with caution. And next question is how we can distinguish hematuria caused by UTI or acute nephritic in a patient with leukocyturia and hematuria in young children. Culture needs 5 days to get the results. I think this question is towards me. This hematuria caused by UTI, definitely you will not have other features of acute nephritic syndrome. It will not be associated with the edema. It will not be associated with other clinical examination finding of high blood pressure. It is just you will have febrile illness. Acute nephritic syndrome, it is not, it is always associated with hypertension, significant edema. It can have pulmonary edema features. You can have abnormal renal function test as well. But as in simple UTI, you don't find all these things. You don't have edema in a UTI child. You don't have hypertension. Yeah, and any child with acute nephritic syndrome, they might have a little bit of leukocyturia that is not considered to be as UTI.
Yeah. Acanthocytes are seen in only kidney diseases. Are acanthocytes seen only in kidney diseases?
Yeah, the glomerular hematuria, you need to, that's what in urine microscopy we have discussed. The dysmorphic RBCs, you will get to see only in glomerular hematuria. When you have acute nephritis, you will find glomerular hematuria and you will have acanthocytes, which will be more than 5% out of the 20% of glomerular hematuria. Next question is acanthocytes.
No, that's I'm asking you questions, ma'am.
Oh, okay, fine.
What is the correlation for hematuria with proteinuria?
What is the correlation? Hematuria, isolated hematuria can be a benign condition also, but when it is associated with significant proteinuria, then it becomes as a red flag sign. So in gross hematuria, you can always have proteinuria, but it will never exceed 2+. And when you quantify the urine, it will never exceed more than 100 milligram per meter square. But if it is associated with proteinuria, means definitely it will be more than 2+, and the proteinuria quantification will exceed more than 100 mg per meter square, though you have gross hematuria.
Yeah. What are DDs we should consider in a 9-year-old girl with gross hematuria, exacerbated by exertion, isomorphic RBCs in urine, few calcium oxalate dihydrate crystals, 24 urine examination, no hypercalciuria, no proteinuria, no oxaluria or uricosuria, CT abdonormal, Doppler normal. What are the DDs we should consider for exertional exacerbation of gross hematuria?
I'm not able to follow the question. I just wanted to.
There is a gross hematuria which is exacerbated.
Once again, I'll just put the question in a bigger screen.
Okay.
It was minimized. 1 second. Okay. What are the DDs? That is what they want to know. Should be considered in a 9-year-old girl with gross hematuria exacerbated by exertion, isomorphic RBCs in urine, few calcium oxalate dihydrate crystals, 24 hours urine examination, no hypercalciuria, proteinuria or oxaluria, uricosuria, abdominal normal, Doppler normal. What are the DDs we should consider for exertional exacerbation of gross hematuria? when you have a strenuous, it all falls under, you need to first confirm whether it is transient hematuria or it is a persistent hematuria. For that, you need to do a urine microscopy at least weeks apart. And if it is 3 subsequent urine microscopy, if it shows significant hematuria, that is when it is more than 5 RBCs per high power field, then it becomes persistent hematuria. Otherwise, it should be just a cause of transient hematuria.
Ma'am, she's talking about, sorry, he's talking about gross hematuria.
She's talking.
It's not microscopy.
Gross hematuria,
gross
okay. Vascular causes you need to consider, you need to go ahead doing a Doppler. Doppler is also normal. That's what you put.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you need to do a renal biopsy. Any child who's having gross hematuria and which is persistent, then you definitely need to go ahead doing a biopsy. Do the other renal function test. Look at the urea, creatinine, other electrolytes. Whether the child is having any features of increased blood urea or increased creatinine.
So definitely gross hematuria cannot be exercise induced. So if it persists, we need to go ahead with biopsy.
We need to do going ahead with a biopsy.
Yeah.
And
is the cutoff of more than 5 RBCs per high power field common for uncentrifuged as well as centrifuged specimen?
It is common, but what the reason, a few other guidelines says when you have more than even 2 to 3 RBCs per high power field, it is considered as hematuria, but it should be confirmed in subsequent urine samples. 5 RBCs is considered as significant.
Yeah, but for centrifuge sample, generally we measure in ml. Here we measure in
millimeter cube.
Millimeter.
That's what I have mentioned. In uncentrifuged, it is read as millimeter cube.
Millimeter
in centrifuge, it is per high power field.
Yes. In an otherwise typical nephrotic syndrome child with microscopic hematuria, dysmorphic RBCs, normal C3, no other systemic manifestations, do we need to think of biopsy before treating or considering steroid? Can the dysmorphic RBCs result from FSGS, which may or may not be steroid sensitive illness eventually, or it always points to something sinister like IgA or proliferative GL? Actually, I'll take this question.
Yeah, you can take this question. Yeah.
So here is a nephrotic syndrome with microscopic hematuria. Remember, even with minimal change disease, almost 20% can have microscopic hematuria during relapse. So just presence of microscopic hematuria does not warrant further evaluation like biopsy. So I think we'll start with prednisolone. If it persists or if it does not go in remission, then we will consider biopsy. So just presence of few dysmorphic RBCs in nephrotic syndrome, we don't need to immediately proceed for biopsy. This is for you, ma'am. I have 2 years old patient with recurrent UTI, gross hematuria, recurrent for a year, no evidence of stones. Sometimes hematuria, gray brownish color, such as rush pipe. USG was normal, X-ray, no stone appearance, C3 was normal. What we can investigate?
I think you need to do a complete urine analysis, find out whether the RBCs is dysmorphic or it's a normal RBCs. And next thing what you have to do is it need not be stones, which is always documented in ultrasound. You just hypercalciuria alone can cause hematuria. The graveluria per se can cause hematuria, can cause gross hematuria.
I think she's mixing two things together. One side recurrent UTI and other side gross hematuria.
Gross hematuria.
So is it really
first you need to find out whether it is glomerular hematuria or non-glomerular hematuria. The glomerular hematuria, definitely it is going to have the dysmorphic RBCs. So the first step you need to do is you need to do a urine microscopy, which will help us to differentiate whether it is gross or whether it is glomerular or non-glomerular with the presence of dysmorphic RBCs. Because your UTI is not one of the cause for glomerular hematuria. It comes under the cause of non-glomerular and you need not have dysmorphic RBCs there.
Yeah.
Dr. Pankaj, you have anything else to add on?
No, that's fine. I think first we need to differentiate whether it's like are we dealing with UTI or glomerular hematuria. Then only we can.
Yeah, and she has also put that C3 was normal. Everything is towards non-glomerular hematuria.
Non-glomerular, yeah.
And
next
how
question.
do you? Yeah.
How do you suggest to manage and follow a child with nutcracker syndrome?
Nutcracker syndrome. I think Nutcracker syndrome is you have the superior mesenteric artery and the left renal vein and aorta entrapment.
Yeah.
I think I have no idea on that, to be honest. Dr. Pankaj, do you have any idea
Actually,
on that? That
no,
will
I have
go
not.
for a surgeon's call.
Yeah, no, theoretically, if it is really symptomatic, then probably we'll have to go ahead with surgical intervention, and
Surgical
like it
intervention,
will be
yeah.
like vascular reanastomosis. But if it is a mild, we can follow up.
Yeah, fine. And
When should we
so
consider CT angio in undiagnosed glomerular hematuria?
CT angiogram for undiagnosed non-glomerular hematuria.
No.
I think there is no indication for CT angiogram in undiagnosed non-glomerular hematuria. If it is so,
Yeah,
in
probably question is heading for some vascular malformation, like
vascular malformation,
I
I think so vascular malformations, you need to go ahead with CT. You need to find out what the vascular abnormality is.
yeah.
But she has put as non-glomerular hematuria.
What till?
Okay. We did not have biopsy facilities. Okay. In case if you don't have a biopsy
We
facilities,
are
is
there.
that what do we do?
We are there. We, we are
I
available
think
nearby.
biopsy is mandatory.
Yeah.
Yeah. Send it to the referral centers.
Referral
Next
center.
question is, when should we consider cystoscopy in non-glomerular hematuria? When you have recurrent hematuria and you are not able to find out any glomerular cause of it, then it becomes confirmatory. Then you need to proceed with the surgical causes. So you need to go ahead with the cystoscopy. When you're ruled out the glomerular cause is not there, then you have a recurrent hematuria which is non-glomerular origin. Definitely you need to have a cystoscopy done after ruling out all other glomerular causes.
Yes. Okay. Then whether
Next is
RBC casts seen clinically in all glomerular diseases.
RBC, that's what in hypercalciuria you will have a lot of you will have dysmorphic RBCs, but you will not find RBC cast. But in case of acute glomerulonephritis, RBC cast is becomes very much mandatory to diagnose the disease. But definitely you will have dysmorphic RBCs.
Yeah, and it's a lot of operator dependent. Need to be processed immediately with. Okay.
Yeah, it has to be done in a freshly voided urine sample. Only then you can make out RBCs. Next question is protein creatinine urine ratio in infants.
Infancy. Okay, protein creatinine ratio less than 6 months, there are no significant clear data. What is considered as significant? For more than 6 months, up to 2 years, up to 0.5 can be considered as a normal. But again, if in a doubt, we need to confirm with other parameters. And more than 2 years, the level reached is 0.2. So in infancy, particularly 6 months to 1 year, up to 0.5 can be considered as a normal.
Yeah, that answers the question. Next question is idiopathic hypercalcemia. Does it require follow-up and treatment? Definitely it requires follow-up and treatment. Idiopathic hypercalcemia, you would have done at 24 hours urine calcium. And when the calcium is more than 4 milligram per 24 hours, then it confirms your diagnosis of hypercalciuria. You need to find out whether the child has got hypercalciuria as well, because you have put it as idiopathic hypercalcemia. You need to find whether the child has got hypercalciuria as well. And it requires treatment. Because they can have, if you leave it untreated, they can have extravascular deposition of calcium. Next is, can we add metalazone? For what? The question is incomplete. Add metalazone for what? The question is incomplete. Next is for follow-up of nephrotic child with PCR is done, but screening of ACR is done. Am I correct?
No, for follow-up of nephrotic syndrome, okay, for screening, see these all tests, PCR, ACR, 24-hour urinary protein, all are valid. There is no superiority of one above other, particularly in nephrotic syndrome. where we are seeing huge amount of proteinuria. The follow-up with this quantification is important, particularly when we are dealing with steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, where our initial target is decrease in proteinuria, where we may not get adequate response with many of other drugs. So in that scenario, any of these tests is fine. We can follow up with PCR, ACR, which is available nearby to us. So superiority of one above other is not significant in nephrotic syndrome. Yeah, but something like diabetic, hypertension, or CKD, there ACR is a good option. But rest all both can be interchangeably used.
Okay. Next question is abdominal pain, vomiting, family history. Can it be HSP? I think the rashes is missing. Abdominal pain is okay. Vomiting, probably some interception or family history. It is not necessary that in children's with HSP you need to have a positive family history. How you need to check how are the C3 levels, how are the rashes, the other parameters. Like clinically, you need to have the rashes, whether rashes is present or not. If the rashes are not there, then you can't even think of HSP. I think the question is there anything else to add on? Because it is so incomplete, the abdominal pain, vomiting, family history. Can it be HSP? It needs to have rashes. Then you do a, rashes needs to be there. You need to do a C3 levels. If the C3 levels is also normal, then it is fine. But the spread of rashes and other supportive evidence, how are the renal function test, all those things matters.
Yeah.
Next question is, will the correct answers be discussed? I think whenever you are answering the question, the correct answers, whether if the answer is right, it comes as right answer. If the answer is wrong, it means that it pops up when you answer. Right answers will not be discussed. It is very difficult for us to accommodate the same crowd and take up the discussion. It is difficult. Next question is experience of Ellis Kiran. I think, have I skipped the question? Experience of Ellis Kiran.
Frankly, I have not used any experience with you, ma'am.
I have not used.
I have not used, yeah.
If anyone have used, can put their suggestions in the Dropbox. Can we use ACE inhibitors for the management of proteinuria in a child with VUR at stage 3 of CKD?
So once GFR has dropped almost up to stage 3, probably the use of ACE inhibitor at proteinuria need to be with very cautious, because risk of hyperkalemia and further drop in GFR is chances are very high. So
yeah, whenever you have a GFR of less than 50, yes, you stop your ACE inhibitors.
ACE inhibitors.
Okay. Next question is, can we add metalazone as add-on drug in acute renal failure with furosemide? Is a child on dialysis or not on dialysis? It all depends. What is the eGFR? Metalazone is going to cause immense diuresis, but it all depends on the hydration state. It all depends on the underlying disease. Do you have anything else to add? I think there are too many questions. We'll quickly run through the questions.
Yeah, we'll run through.
How does the presence of hematuria affects the quantification of proteinuria? That's what we have already discussed. Even when you have a gross hematuria, your proteinuria should not exceed more than 100 mg per meter square. If you're going to exceed more than 100 mg per meter square, then it is suggestive of glomerular cause of hematuria. It is not just your hematuria alone. It has got proteinuria per se, which is due to glomerular cause.
See, because hematuria, RBC cell wall constitutes protein, so the protein will be apparent in your assessment. So that's why even hematuria can have some amount of protein leak detected by lab.
You will have 2+, but it will not exceed 2+, and it will not exceed the quantification of proteins of more than 100 mg per meter square.
Yeah.
And the next is presence of, exercise worsening gross hematuria, AV malformations. Exercise can worsen gross hematuria, AV. I think I'm not the right person to answer because it is a surgical thing. Do you have any answers for that?
No.
I think AV malformations, I don't think I'm the right person to answer that.
Yeah.
The next question is, child with asymptomatic nephrotic syndrome, 3.7 grams on 24 hours urinary quantification with no edema, normal serum albumin level. was evaluated with kidney biopsy, which revealed membranous nephropathy. What would be the explanation of normal albumin level and no edema with such high grades of proteinuria?
Okay.
Such a big question.
Right. So there is a significant proteinuria.
Pardon?
No, sorry. You are answering something.
No, I'm just asking. Shall I read out the question again for you?
No, I got it. Yeah, according to me, there is a 3.7 gram in 24-hour urine. Biopsy is membranous, but why child still didn't have hypoalbuminemia and edema?
Yeah. You have to look at the tubules. If you have tubular dysfunction also, then you will be having a normal urine output, and there is you might not have the edema per se. You need to check how the urine output is. If the child is going to have a normal urine output, then the child might not have. You can have other tubules also. If it is affected more, then you might have you might not have any edema. The child is having normal serum albumin. I have no answer why the child is having no normal serum albumin. Dr. Pankaj, do you have any answer for that?
Yeah, I think so. Probably you have picked up the case at quite early stage. So before albumin dropped, we have picked up membranous. See, remember in nephrotic, we see huge amount of proteinuria, sometime up to the tune of 8-10 gram in a day. It is such a huge that we will never able to compensate in generally nephrotic or FSGS. Membranous may have, at initial stage, may not have that much amount of proteinuria. So probably child was picked up on asymptomatic urine test, then we quantified, we find out there is a proteinuria. So child was still in asymptomatic stage where you picked up membranous. So maybe at the initial stage of disease, you may not have found out. But with time, when proteinuria will increase further, edema will manifest. Probably that is explanation. I can't find anything other to explain this.
Okay, next is, I think it's a comment with a question. Thank you for the great session. Child with asymptomatic.
Same
I think
question.
it is the same question.
Yeah.
When we should give vaccines to nephrotic syndrome?
I think nephrotic syndrome.
Separate session on nephrotic syndrome. All your questions pertinent to nephrotic syndrome will be answered then. Next is, what if non-eligible ones? I think it is a comment. I think we'll answer the question individually to them. No tubular dysfunction, urine output is adequate. I think it is for the previous question, no tubular dysfunction. Probably, as Dr. Pankaj has already mentioned, probably you have picked up the disease a little earlier. How is the serum cholesterol levels you need to assess, whether they are fitting into a nephrotic syndrome or nephrotic range proteinuria alone? Dr. Pankaj, this was a comment for the previous question.
Yeah, I got that. There is no tubular dysfunction. So I think probably my take will be, we have picked up at asymptomatic stage. That's why still all full-blown picture is not manifested yet.
Okay. And the last question is, can impaired GFR in this membranous very case alter serum albumin? Yes, that's what we are like. We need to know the renal function test. Without knowing the renal function test, it is very difficult, because when you have a decreased GFR, definitely your serum albumin is going to be normal.
Yeah, but in that scenario, proteinuria will drop down. Serum albumin is normal because
proteinuria also has to drop, because when you have a less urine output, your proteinuria also has to drop. It has to go hand in hand. Your proteinuria also drops and your serum albumin starts building up. Anything else? I think we are done with the questions. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Pankaj. It was really, and I think we had the maximum questions in this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Pankaj, for the elaborate discussion on proteinuria. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving this opportunity.
Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.